Chapter 16. Bellum Omnium Contra Omnes. Thursday, November 14th, 1991. Rays of light reflected off the airplane hangar's metallic roof, piercing Virgil's eyes and further inflaming his fatigue-induced headache, more so than the glare from the valley's sea of salt. A double-wide roll-up door faced the small patch of asphalt the van had parked on. There were no other vehicles or structures as far as Virgil could see. His legs ached from sitting for so long, like someone had twisted a blade deep into his thighs. He followed Agent Rylos's lead, stepping from their transport and stretching his arms toward the sky while extending his back and standing on the tips of his toes. Flexibility offers an immeasurable tactical advantage, Agent Rylos said, as if to himself. Virgil nodded, going the extra mile by bending to touch his toes. As he stood upright, he asked the obvious. "Where are we?" "The Salt Flats, just west of Salt Lake City. This is where your final test will take place." Agent Rylos paused in front of the hangar door. "Have you ever heard of the Josephus problem?" "No," Virgil admitted. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian who wrote about his own experience during their war with Rome nearly 2,000 years ago. Like anything from humanity's past, the details vary, depending on who was telling the tale. But what seems to be clear is that during a siege, he, along with other Jewish soldiers, was trapped by the Roman army. They were surrounded with no chance of escape. Josephus's soldiers knew what horrors awaited if they surrendered. So instead, they sat in a circle and agreed to go round and round, taking turns killing the person on their left until just one soldier remained. That way, only the last man alive would have to commit suicide. "Why didn't they all just kill themselves?" Virgil asked. Suicide carried religious prohibitions. Josephus preferred capture to death, but didn't dare tell the other soldiers for fear they'd turn on him. While everyone was setting up the circle and handing out swords, Josephus figured out where to sit to ensure he'd be the last man alive. Agent Rylos's tale was cut short by the screeching of the hangar's metal door rolling open. The moral of this story became immediately apparent. Dozens of metallic chairs were arranged in a giant circle. They looked like modernized thrones, Virgil thought. He followed Agent Rylos into the dimly lit building. It took his eyes a long time to adjust before he saw the group of boys gathered on the far side of the hangar. All of them had their hair, and he recognized many Stardust kids from Camp Meta. Virgil followed the agent into the center of the thrones, inspecting one as he passed by. There were large clamps on the armrests and near the footrest. On the headrest was a number carved into a glowing halo, with the sequence increasing in the clockwise direction of the seating arrangement. On the floor before each chair was metal grating that led to the center of the space, like spokes converging on the hub of a wheel. A portly older man was walking the circle, sliding metal swords into custom mounts on the side of each chair. "Who's he?" Virgil asked. "An antique collector I occasionally call on." "Everyone, on me!" Agent Rylos shouted to the other boys, who crowded around Virgil. "Only one of you will leave this building alive," Agent Rylos explained. None of the boys flinched at the declaration. "You'll have 5 minutes to pick a seat. There's one for each of you, but it's first come, first served. You cannot take a seat from someone else once they've sat down. If after 5 minutes you are still standing, my associate with the swords, Mr. Cherrick, will pick one for you." "What happens after we're seated?" Virgil asked. All eyes turned to him. Each boy had the gaze of a proven killer. Agent Rylos smiled, walking to the chair closest to him. "That's when the game begins. I'll pick a starting number. That person will draw their gladius," he said while pulling the large double-edged blade from the chair, "and stab the closest living person immediately to their left. This pattern will continue until all but one of you is dead. So choose your seat wisely." He returned the blade to its mount. "Good luck." 34 beams of white light lit up the individual seats. Virgil wasted no time, closing his eyes and mentally working through the problem. The starting point was random, which meant it was beyond his control, but a general pattern could still be deduced. There were 34 seats, and every other person would be killed. It would take 5 cycles around the circle until only one boy remained. It was a power of 2 problem. Virgil opened his eyes to find a few boys had acted boldly, embracing probability and randomly picking chairs. Virgil closed his eyes again. If he picked the highest power of 2 possible in 34, that was 2 to the 5th, which equaled 32. The leftover 2 was the key to the solution. Whoever sat in the seat 2 times that leftover amount or the 4th chair clockwise from the starting point would survive. Virgil ran the numbers in binary transformation, applying a trick he'd learned from Tom when optimizing code, and came to the same conclusion. He glowed from his algorithmic eureka moment. But the feeling was fleeting. The starting point was unknowable since Agent Rylos would pick it. Virgil opened his eyes. Half the seats were now occupied. He was running out of time to act on his incomplete theory. He scanned the throne numbers and noticed a pattern. Most of the open seats were even numbers. But one exception caught his attention. Number 5. This triggered a memory of Dr. Kincaid's lesson on historical battle odds. If Agent Rylos picked number 1 to start, a choice so obvious it bordered on ludicrous, then the algorithm would work perfectly since number 5 would be the next seat after the first 2 steps of slaughter. It was the closest Virgil could get to a viable solution, and he rushed to the empty chair. "Time's up," Agent Rylos announced. Mr. Cherrick escorted each of the indecisive boys to the nearest remaining seat. "Place your ankles and wrists against the clamps," Agent Rylos instructed. The metal locks closed, and the game caller paced the circle to ensure each boy was secured. Then the beams of light disappeared. "When it's your turn, your clamps will open and a column of light will illuminate your chair. A red 1 will light up your target's throne. You will have 1 minute to grab your gladius, kill that person, and return the sword to its mount before retaking your seat. If you're not in your chair when the clamps close, Mr. Cherrick will run a blade through you himself." The elderly assistant stood in the shadows, gladius in hand. Virgil hadn't factored this possibility into his algorithm. A single act of disobedience would throw off his calculations. He could only hope the other boys' desire for self-preservation and Agent Rylos' threat of certain death if they deviated would negate the possibility. Then again, he thought, the starting point hadn't been selected yet, so everything still hinged on an element of luck. The providence of Agent Rylos' next words knocked the air from Virgil's lungs. "We'll start with lucky number 1. The locks on the first boy's throne opened. He stood, retrieved his gladius, and approached the boy next to him, bathed in red. The attacker ignored the cries for mercy and plunged the blade into the victim's abdomen before returning to his seat. A quick analysis made it clear Virgil would be saved this round, but 17 others would fall. He'd been so focused on finding the right solution that he'd overlooked the horror involved with witnessing each murder, including the one he'd have to dole out. As the boy to his right exhaled his last breath, the reality of what came next set in. Boy number 3 returned to his seat just as Virgil's clamps unlocked. He stood, gripped the handle of the gladius, and walked to boy number 6, who sat stoically ready to face his fate. Virgil recognized him. It was the Stardust Kid who shoved him to and from the shower at Camp Meta after his first night in the Boo-Hoo room. He hesitated for a moment, denying what he had to do, but the ticking sound of an unseeable clock pushed him onward. Virgil maintained eye contact as he drove the sword into the young man's heart, but his strike was stopped prematurely by bone. He'd aimed too high. The boy choked on blood and gasped for air as Virgil leaned in, putting all of his weight behind the blade to break through the breastbone. Virgil's hands were trembling as life left the child's eyes. Then he withdrew the weapon and returned to his seat. 8 more boys died when the second wave of carnage traveled around the circle. Some pleaded for their lives, others mocked their executioners, and a few laughed deliriously. Virgil's second target proved to be one of the beggars, pleading in the final seconds of his life. The sight of the boy's long hair fueled the flames of Virgil's anger. He ran the young man through with one powerful push before returning to his throne to await the next signal to deal out another death. Virgil was increasingly confident he occupied the winning seat. The third pass through the circle started with the demise of boy number 1. Caught off guard by the arrival of his own end, he screamed like a cornered animal, causing a few of the boys to weep. Virgil rationalized with himself, acknowledging that all the other boys were following a similar plan of self-preservation. Virgil's aim was improving as he cut down the boy in seat number 9 with minimal effort. The cycle of self-interest played out as planned, with 4 more falling in that round. Streams of blood poured from the bodies and disappeared into the grates. The remaining boys didn't try to hide their fear. None of them had the numerical confidence of Virgil. The time for contemplation between killings shrunk in tandem with the probability of a defection that would destroy Virgil. Boy number 13 spat in Virgil's face as he closed in for the kill during the 4th cycle. Despite his feelings of sorrow for the defiant child, he held constant eye contact with the boy until he passed. Virgil only had 1 minute in his seat, until the final kill of the day arrived. He walked across the circle to the red illumination on boy 21, who faced the terminus of his life with a smile. He'd been so close to surviving, Virgil thought, accepting the role of executioner and expertly piercing the child's heart. Acting out of conditioning, Virgil placed the sword in the mount on his chair and took a seat. The clamps didn't close. The game was over. 33 bodies slumped in their chairs, feeding the sea of blood flooding into the grated spokes. Agent Rylos circled the ring of corpses, slowly clapping. "Is this what my sister endured to join the Black Star Hunters?" Virgil asked, staring down at his crimson-stained hands. "No. Her test was considerably different, a reflection of the disparate roles you'll fill. You have to become the teacher, Virgil, which means you have to be 100 times more capable than your students. Otherwise, how can you prepare them to succeed? Your sister, as gifted as she is, will never reach your level. But that isn't necessary. If you impart even 20% of what you're capable of on her, she'll be an unstoppable force against the Federation. Did you set this up so I'd win?" "There's an apt saying I heard during battle," Agent Rylos replied. "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything." Virgil recognized it as a variant of something his father quoted all the time. Winston Churchill. Close. It was Eisenhower, though it gets misattributed to the British bulldog because he said something similar. What was that? "The best generals are those who arrive at the results of planning without being tied to plans." Virgil huffed at the irony. "Do you know why both of those quotes contain truth?" Virgil shrugged. "Because of the role luck plays?" "Exactly," Agent Rylos said enthusiastically. "I knew I'd start with the first seat because if you were looking for a solution, that was a logical place to begin. A focal point. It was clear from watching you formulate a strategy that you came to a similar conclusion. But had even one of those boys hesitated or refused, your plan would have gone to shit. Luck played as much of a role today as your stratagem. In my experience, this is what produces the great generals of history. They reduce the probability of failure as much as they can, then charge bravely into the face of danger, knowing there's nothing more they can do. Napoleon recognized this pattern, and before appointing anyone to the rank of general in his army, he'd interview those closest to the candidate. Do you know what he'd ask those people about the potential general-to-be? No. If they were lucky. Agent Rylos offered his hand. "Welcome to the Black Star Hunters, Virgil Wolfe."